Why is the Resident Evil franchise moving away from its roots? As we examine their games, we will attempt to understand the clever decisions made by Capcom to grow their best-selling franchise. I will be discussing how the Resident Evil games performed during their time of release, how their gameplay focus changes over time, and what elements each game included to heighten its impact. However, that's not all we're going to delve into, as I plan to uncover parts of Capcom's history and the mindset that they had while creating their games, and this may help us shed light on what influenced Capcom to change the Resident Evil series. Capcom was founded on May 30th, 1979 in Japan. They originally focused on creating arcade games such as Street Fighter, 1942, and Vulgus, establishing them as a popular brand in the late 90s. Capsule Computers continued to expand their portfolio of games by releasing titles such as Mega Man and Resident Evil, with the latter specifically leaving a long-lasting and positive mark on the company. By examining Capcom's early entries into the series, we can see that they all followed the survival horror route, which was most popular around the late 90s to mid-2000s. This is a key component of the franchise's early development, but I'll touch on the genre more later in the video. However, this was not Capcom's first time creating a survival horror game. Prior to Resident Evil, Capcom released a game called Sweet Home, which acted as a sort of predecessor to the survival horror genre. Sweet Home was developed and released in 1989 on the Famicom, with its sole purpose being to accompany a horror film, also called Sweet Home, which shared the same year of release, story, characters, and setting. Shortly after its release, it began to be praised by fans for its storytelling, puzzles, and eerie atmosphere. I wonder what other games also had this same atmosphere. It's no secret that Capcom carried over some key components from this game into the Resident Evil franchise, but it is interesting to see how the well-received feedback from a game that was supposed to accompany a now forgotten film formed one of the biggest video games in history. Early entries into the franchise contain a heavy lean on certain gameplay elements, such as inventory management, map navigation, enemy evasion, and puzzle solving. In this section, I'm mainly going to talk about Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, as these games in particular have the deepest focus on survival horror, out of possibly the whole franchise. Resident Evil 1 sees you playing as either Jill Valentine or Chris Redfield, with both options altering your experience of the game. In Resident Evil 2, the choice between two characters is seen again with Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield. However, this time, both characters are accompanied by their own version of the story, prompting players to play through the game more than once. One thing both of these games outdo themselves with is the atmospheric tension. This is built up over time by the use of sparsely lit areas, haunting sound design, and the anticipation of when you will inevitably encounter your next foe. Resident Evil 1 and 2 both significantly benefit from having fixed camera angles, as they limit the field of view and leave what's out of view up to the player's imagination. Especially when navigating through tight corridors, it installs the player with a sense of claustrophobia. The rarity of resources such as healing items and ammunition leave you feeling vulnerable as you carry yourself through these vast and unknown locations. However, the feeling the player gets when they do come across any useful material is somewhat similar to finding a beacon of light in a pit of darkness. This forces the player to create strategic plans of when and when not to engage. Fans seem to enjoy this style of gameplay, stating that they enjoyed the challenge of managing their inventory, solving tricky puzzles, and the overall atmosphere of the games. History also proves this, as when the original Resident Evil released, it became the highest selling PlayStation game at the time, and had sold around 4 million copies worldwide by the end of 1997, which makes the route they take with the next few games very interesting. Now, let's venture into the heart of Racoon City and discuss how Resident Evil 3 managed to create a somewhat perfect mix of survival horror and action-based gameplay. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis brings a more action-orientated approach to the table when compared to its forerunners. The game held an emphasis on combat and set the stage for the upcoming entries. Although, it did carry over certain features from previously mentioned games, such as the ominous atmosphere of Racoon City. This installation into the series delivers a fresh take into the classic Resident Evil gameplay, by adding dynamic gameplay elements, such as the relentless pursuit of the game's main antagonist, Nemesis. This enemy is a fun challenge, testing both your skills and bravery, as you will need to decide whether to flee to safety or take him on multiple times throughout the game. As the player steps back into the shoes of Jill Valentine from Resident Evil 1, they feel a sense of familiarity, whilst there still being new things in the game for them to enjoy. What makes Resident Evil 3 the black sheep of the series is that it contains too many action sequences to be classed as a survival horror, but also contains classic horror game elements as well, such as fixed camera angles, puzzle solving, and more elements seen in the previous two entries, which makes it hard to fit it into the action horror category. Most fans seem to love how the series was evolving towards more action-packed gameplay, and this could be proven by the 12.4 million copies sold worldwide. However, there were plenty fans who disagreed with this and feared that the Resident Evil series would lose its spark and disconnect from its roots. Only the developers could decide the course of the series, leaving fans to watch from the sidelines and hope for the desired outcome.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
In the evolution of the Resident Evil series, a noticeable shift occurred alongside the release of Resident Evil 4 and 5. These entries pinpoint the departure from the survival horror roots of the franchise, navigating towards a more action-focused gameplay experience. Now, I'm going to talk about the critically acclaimed golden goose and turning point of the series, Resident Evil 4. This is where Capcom starts to favour action-orientated gameplay over survival horror. As soon as you take control of Leon, you can really feel how the series has advanced, with a shift to an over-the-shoulder perspective, refined combat mechanics which changes the entirety of the game, specifically the bosses and quick-time events. Many features introduced into this game would make an appearance in the next couple of entries, however not all of them would be present. At the time, this game threw a curveball at Resident Evil fans, and revolutionised the gaming industry as a whole, influencing multiple AAA games such as Gears of War and The Last of Us to utilise features from Resident Evil 4 into their own games. With this becoming the new standard for games, it's safe to say that other companies had a lot to compete with. But it didn't stop there. Resident Evil 4 went on to sell over 13 million copies worldwide and win multiple Game of the Year awards in 2005, which was no easy feat, having some heavy contenders alongside it like God of War, Call of Duty 2, and Grand Theft Auto Liberty City, which are all great games and still praised to the present day. What made this even more impressive was that the game performed flawlessly on the hardware that it was originally released on, which was the Nintendo GameCube, and later ported onto the PlayStation 2. Now, with all those achievements, I'm sure you would expect that the entirety of the fanbase would adore this game, right? Well, this wasn't the case, and the community was split in two, with one half complimenting Resident Evil's growth, and the latter critiquing the story and disliking the over-involvement of weapons in action. Both sides made great and understandable points, but would Capcom listen to fans and dial the action down to how it was in the original few games, or continue into the action horror gameplay that elevated them to new levels of success and fame? The global success of Resident Evil 4 was undeniable and influenced the development of Resident Evil 5. Capcom saw grave potential in their new formula and doubled down on it. 4 years later, Capcom released Resident Evil 5. This entry into the series continued the motion created by Resident Evil 4, with a heavier focus on action and even introduced co-op gameplay. This was huge at the time, as not many other games offered the co-op gameplay experience. The horror elements, while still present, took a backseat to the adrenaline-pumping action sequences and large set pieces, but looking at it from a revenue-based perspective, this was a great decision, as by recent records the game has almost sold 16 million copies. which makes it a better seller than Resident Evil 4, and the best seller in the franchise at the time. Although it is important to note that this change wasn't solely about aborting their old gameplay structure, but more about the fact that they had to evolve for Capcom to stand a chance against the games that were dominating the market at the time, such as Uncharted and Call of Duty. Many people believe that this shift was purely a business decision, but this isn't entirely true. It was a response to gamers' evolving taste as the demand for action-focused games were growing, and Capcom took an opportunity to expand their franchise. And who can blame them? But this leap away from the series' roots ultimately left longtime fans feeling disconnected, as the original Resident Evil games were defined by their atmosphere, resource management, and sense of vulnerability. These elements are extremely transparent in Resident Evil 5, if even being there at all.
Resident Evil 6.
Resident Evil 6, released in 2012, is almost unrecognisable when compared to the survival horror origins of the series. While Resident Evil 4 had introduced more action elements, and Resident Evil 5 had pushed this boundary further, Resident Evil 6 takes things to a whole new level. It was a massive, sprawling game with 4 separate campaigns, each featuring its own storylines, characters, and gameplay styles. But what stood out most was the sheer amount of action, explosions, gunfights, and set pieces everywhere in the game. It was clear that Capcom was trying to cater to a broader audience, one that was more accustomed to blockbuster action games than the slow, tense survival horror the series was well known for. In Resident Evil 6, you are armed to the teeth whilst mowing down hordes of enemies, with very little emphasis on horror. Even when we compare this game to Resident Evil 5, which was already criticised for being too action-focused, Resident Evil 6 clarifies the route Capcom was taking. This game was so action-packed that it barely resembled the survival horror genre the series was well known for. Despite this dramatic shift in tone and gameplay, Resident Evil 6 initially sold well, moving over 5 million copies worldwide. However, this success was very short-lived, and the game quickly faced backlash from fans and critics. Many stated that the game had strayed way too far from what was expected by the fans. The action in the game was described as over the top and way too convoluted. Some people even mentioned that the storyline had left a so-called sour taste in their mouths, and that this game had disgraced the original entries. The critical reception was lukewarm, and whilst the sales were strong, they didn't meet Capcom's high expectations. The reaction was so negative that many believed that the end was near for the franchise as a whole. Fans were very vocal about their disappointment, and the future of the Resident Evil series seemed uncertain. Resident Evil, once the gold standard for survival horror, appeared to be lost in sea and stranded by its own creators. Resident Evil 6 was a much needed wake-up call for Capcom. It was a clear indication that the franchise had drifted too far from its roots, and the fans weren't happy about it. The game's reception forced the developers to reconsider the direction in which they were taking the series, eventually leading to a much needed course correction. But at that time, it felt like the end of an era, one that left many wondering if Resident Evil would revive its series.
Where am I? What the hell?
Rise and shine, sleepyhead. It's time for supper.
Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was a major turning point for the series when it launched in 2017. After the more action-heavy Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6, fans were missing the pure horror that defined the early games. Capcom eventually listened and decided to take the franchise back to its roots. Resident Evil 7 ditched the over-the-top action for a more intimate first-person experience, which brought back the tension, survival horror elements, and the constant sense of dread. The creepy Louisiana setting, with the terrifying Baker family, were a far cry from the globe-trotting explosions of the previous games. Fans and critics alike loved this game, and it was praised for reviving the horror elements that had been long lost. It was a massive success, selling over 11 million copies and winning many awards. Resident Evil 7 didn't just bring back the series, it reminded everyone what made Resident Evil truly special in the first place, and made fans wonder what Capcom was still capable of.
Jesus Christ!
After Resident Evil 7 returned the franchise to its roots, Capcom decided to remain there for a while and release remakes of the critically acclaimed Resident Evil 2 and 3. These games satisfied customers and succeeded at pushing the game out to a wider audience through the use of their new game engine, RE Engine. This offered up-to-date graphics, new camera angles, movement and story narrative, and it's safe to say fans loved this, with Resident Evil 2 Remake selling 13.6 million copies and Resident Evil 3, releasing 1 year later, selling 8.4 million copies. While both of these games had quite a bit of cut content from the originals, players were still glad to see the return of classic characters in the survival horror that made the franchise big in the first place. Although, just 1 year after the release of Resident Evil 3 Remake, Capcom released Resident Evil Village. At this time, all the fans believed that the game would stay at its survival horror roots, and justifiably so. However, Village, while still carrying over some fear factors from Resident Evil 7, was slowly once again shifting back to the action-focused gameplay that scared fans in the first place. With a vast stock of ammunition and consumables, players weren't forced to worry about preserving their items, as they would come across more shortly, and fearing about boss fights was a thing of the past as the game would stock you up before. And it didn't end here, with Resident Evil 4 Remake placing the franchise back on the split road where the series once strayed from its well-worn path. This has left fans of the franchise wondering what route Capcom will take for the long-awaited Resident Evil 9. Now that we have analysed a selection of games in the franchise, can we answer the question, why is Resident Evil moving away from its roots? Well, ultimately, Capcom is trying to evolve the series while keeping it relevant, walking a fine line between innovation and tradition. And whether you prefer the classic horror roots or the newer action-packed approach, it's clear that Resident Evil will always be willing to take risks.